So we got some progress on Daniel's Fiesta ST finally. After 3 to 4 months of farting around, trying to get everything lined up, we finally have a short block. So a little hesitant to show you this because this isn't what we're going to be offering for our short blocks. It's a little different. This was actually built by somebody else. Not going to name any names, but it begins with speed. And it had basically had a failure. We had taken it apart and we noticed that the cam gears were not torqued down, so it actually jumped timing. And as we dug deeper into the short block itself, we had noticed some issues with the assembly elsewhere as well. So this block was previously done as far as machining goes. We have sleeve liners in here. So the factory sleeves were actually bored out and these were pressed in. And then this has a CSS, which is a cylinder support system, added as well. So we might be adding the CSS to the 1.5 blocks we'll be using for our builds. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch the last video I posted up. But we might be adding CSS, just to add some rigidity to the top of the cylinders, because it is an open deck, so you get a little bit of you know, some deflection in the cylinder, especially when you're making bigger power. When we do sleeve blocks, so for bigger power stuff, we're still using the 1.5 block more than likely. We'll determine that later, but if we do, we're going to be boring out the factory cylinder completely and adding an entire new sleeve, which will take place or fill the space where the CSS has been added. So just keep in mind that our kind of like our first step short block will just be rods, pistons, and a 1.5 block. Will be machined with a torque plate that we had made. That was one of the delays for having this thing built. But we got torque plates made for these, so we should be able to start turning out some short blocks here soon. And we're also going to be offering a cylinder head, which is here as well. We'll get into that in another clip. But we should be able to have our short blocks and long blocks up on the website before the end of the month for you to purchase. And there'll be a long block option as well, which will include everything assembled, oil pan to valve cover. So as far as specs of this engine, it's just a 1.6 block with that sleeving I showed and the CSS added. And then we have K1 rods, which we're not going to be using in our builds. We're actually using some custom rods made for us. This has R pistons in it, which you just saw before I flipped it over. And then this is a R Sport baffle that's been added. We will offer this as an option to be added if you build a long block. But if you get a short block, you will not get any oil pickup or anything. You're just going to get the block with a crank in it, rods, pistons, fully assembled, machined, ready to go. So this as well has a factory modified crank. So it's just a 1.6 crank that's been lightened up. It's a service performed by Cali's, which if you would like that to be in your build, we can offer it. But realistically, I don't think it's really gonna be worth it for what these engines are really gonna be capable of for power. You know, 500 horsepower and under is probably the safe point for these. We're obviously going to push a little further and see what our fully sleeved option is going to be able to make. But really the biggest downside, as I mentioned in my previous video, is the displacement of these things. So them being 1.6, you really don't get a lot of turbo options that are going to be able to spool quickly and keep the car fun to drive on the street. So, but short block, I'm still spinning this thing over. I don't know why, but I'm going to continue to do so. But Cody's over there cleaning some bolts. We're at the point of adding the oil pan now. So we got some alignment studs that Cody whittled up. So these will allow us to center the oil pan when we drop it on, because there's no dowels or anything on this. So we'll drop the oil pan on with some fancy sealant, get that torqued down. Then we'll be able to flip this thing back over and get the head studs in, drop the gasket on, drop the head on. So while Cody's splooging up the oil pan here, we'll go over a couple things before we get the oil pan on. So one thing, you should probably pull this sticker off if you buy a new oil pickup tube, because the last thing you need is a sticker floating around in your oil pan going in here. So before you drop the oil pan on, I'd recommend throwing some sealant on each of these joints here where you have the oil pump meeting to the block, and then you have the rear main seal going to the block as well. So these are common leak points, especially on the Focus, ST, RS, and Mustang blocks. So we'll add a big old line there, and then we'll drop the oil pan on, torque it down. mint. So these just help center it on there when you're dropping the oil pan down. Instead of setting it down without any sort of alignment and then having to move this, it'll smear the sealant everywhere and you risk getting a leak. So we got the bolts all cleaned up. We're actually using the factory bolts again on here. They weren't too bad. Just knocked all the sealant off of them and cleaned the threads, just kind of chased the threads. And that's it. We'll get that torqued down, flip the engine over, get the head studs in it and the gasket on, and we'll drop the head on it. So I got the head studs here for that Fiesta block we are assembling. I just kind of want to go over a few things before installing head studs. So if you are assembling an engine yourself, what I always do with these things is, first of all, you clean them. Even if they're brand new right out of the box, there's still machining oil on them that keep them from scaling or getting any surface rust or anything on them. You just want to clean all that off. So I just usually lay these down on a towel, hit them with some brake clean, and then rub them dry with like a microfiber or a blue shop towel, and then just make sure everything's clean, because when you go to assemble on the top side here for the nuts, you're going to be using some ARP assembly lube, and you just want to have a nice clean surface to really utilize that lube for, oh god, that's a lot of lube talk. Anyways, for when you torque these down, you get an accurate torque measurement. So additionally on that lube, you only want it actually on the threads here, and you want it on the bottom of the nut itself. So you don't want to put, if you look at these are broached. They have these kind of like little dimples in them, and what that's used for is to bite onto the cylinder head as you torque down, to keep these things from spinning as you torque, because if these spin, you actually get you know, an inaccurate torque measurement. So these need to be installed dry, and then you put the ARP assembly lube on the bottom of this nut here and on the threads, and then you torque that down on top of it. Then on the studs themselves, after all clean, what I usually do is I'll put a little bit of lube on the bottom there. Either use engine oil or I just use Sil Glide. You put a very, very small amount on the bottom, and then just run them along the threads, and as you torque it in, it'll, you know, go in, which you're actually not torquing these. It's another thing I need to mention is, just because it has a hex broach on the top there for you to use an Allen key or a hex socket, you're not torquing them into the block. You're just finger tightening them all the way down. If you're going to use any sort of hex tool in here, it's just to make sure that you've reached the end of the threads and you're using as little pressure as possible, because these aren't bottoming them out on the bottom of the thread hole, of the head stud hole or the head bolt hole. These are actually stopping when they run out of threads. So you're finger tightening these down into the block, and then you're putting all the torque on here. This will pull this stud up and it'll keep it from spinning out. So do not torque these into the block. We just took apart a Focus ST, or sorry, Focus RS engine, that these were all torqued in. So that's in another video. We'll talk about that later. So cylinder head is on. Cody threw the studs in, dropped a gasket on it, then popped this head on. So he's just getting some lube on the nuts. And we're going to drop those things in there and torque this thing down. So this is a brand new OEM head. All of our cylinder heads are going to start off from brand new OEM. We're probably not going to offer anything that uses a head core or have you send in a head core, just because it takes so much additional work to clean up a head that's been used, and you know, you run the risk of just kind of dealing with, you know, a dirty ass head and trying to clean it and put some wire wheels to it. You know, it's not a good time, and I don't like to do it. So you're gonna have to pay for a brand new head. This is just a pocket port head, so that means none of the actual runners themselves are ported. You're really not gonna get a huge gain hogging out the runners on these things. You know, this is a similar style inlet to the 2.0 and 2.3 head, and then on the exhaust side, obviously this is unique because it has a 4-port. Whereas the 2.0 has a single port in the middle, and then the 2.3 has 2 ports on the bottom, a big port on top for the twin scroll setup that they have. So we've done a ton of testing on these cylinder heads, and you know, just looking at this one, we can already tell that if we spend a lot of time here, the time would not be worth, and the cost to the customer would not be worth the additional flow that you get. It's very, very minimal. So a lot of the flow happens down in the actual throat by the valves. So what we do is just do a little pocket port, then we clean the combustion chambers up a little bit as well. Then we do a proprietary valve job on these things as well, performance-oriented valve job. And that's pretty much it for the head. Normally we would O-ring them, All of our cylinder heads in the future will include O-ringing, but I still need to have the CNC work path still drawn up so we can actually cut the heads and add O-rings to them. So that head over there is actually O-ringed. See if I can lift it up here. God, there's so much shit. So you can see here there's copper O-rings on every cylinder, and that just kind of allows, you know, the gasket to be crushed around the cylinder to increase the actual sealing around the combustion chambers to prevent any head lift and, you know, blowing out a head gasket. So we're going to be offering that as well on the Fiesta. We just need to draw the program up still. We didn't have any time to do it, but more than likely for the engine we're building for the trash Fiesta that is actually collecting trash, it looks like right now, we're going to be sending that head out to get the profile done and get the O-ring done as well. So Cody's going to get this thing torqued down, and then he's going to get the engine pretty much wrapped up, and then we'll move on to getting the turbo kit installed and dropping this thing in the car. So now that the cams are in, kind of want to show you how this thing is timed. So you have a timing tool kit. It works the same as the 2.0 and 2.3s, but essentially you stick the plate in, that dowel's in the way, but you have to remove it. This goes in, and these two slide into the camshaft. So you can see the lines here. So this goes in here. And then you have a cam holder for the cam gears itself, and a top dead center line here and a top dead center mark there. So set these at 12 o'clock, put this in. This is going to help you torque these cam gears down. And then after they're torqued down, these caps actually go on top of them because there's oil in here to control the VCT. So this will go on, and you torque these down last. And then you just pop the timing belt on and pull the grenade pin. The last step for the timing is actually setting the crank pulley position. So this is a little tool that bolts where the factory crank position sensor goes. And then it has these two little pegs, kind of hard to see, that go into a notch in the crank pulley. That holds the position, torque down the crank pulley, and then pull this out and replace it with a crank position sensor. So that's pretty much going to do it for this video. Now that we got the long block pretty much assembled, we need to get the flywheel and clutch and the transmission on, and that's not too exciting. So we'll have another update for this build probably in the next week. We'll upload a new video going over the turbo kit and everything that's going on at fuel system, shit like that. So that'll do her. We'll probably have another video out between this update and the next update on this car, and that's going to be pretty much it. So check out this interior on this 2021 F-150. It is so badass, and the shifter folds down and the armrest flips forward so you can eat Chick-fil-A nuggies. It's just awesome. This is my favorite F-150 yet by far. Goodbye. You did not. What'd you say? I know you didn't.
Should I?
You probably shouldn't. You probably should. You should DM her.
Say what?
Invite her out here. Say, yo, cut this short block.
Cut this.
You want this short block? All you gotta do is, you know, honk honk.